Hi everyone, welcome back to Camp in a Box. Today we're going to make our very own fancy Hollywood fashion out of some craft supplies and leftover material from other Camp in the Box projects. Let's get started. You're going to want something to apply color, whether that's markers, crayons, or even watercolors. Here I have some DIY watercolors that I made, which the recipe is also in your camp box. You also need things like glitter and of course glue to hold everything down. Lastly, like normal, you're going to need writing utensils, paintbrushes, and a pair of scissors. This project really is all about how creative and crazy can you get with your template. So take a look at your leftover materials as well as the things that came in your camp box to really decide what you want to do with your template and what sort of outfit you want to create. I started by dumping out my little bag of craft supplies and sorted through the beads and buttons to figure out what colors I liked and what I was going to base my drawing on. I decided to go with a lot of different silvers and bronzes and greens just because those happen to be my favorite colors. When looking at the feathers, I decided to go ahead and stick with blue to keep with more of a cool color palette. To keep your workspace from getting too messy, make sure that you put all of the extra craft materials you're not going to use off to the side. Then, grab your scrap materials and start playing around and see what you can do. I had some white paper, some cardboard, aluminum foil, and some construction paper, as well as my markers that I had on hand. I decided to add in a little pop of yellow, and I was ready to get started playing with my scraps and piecing together an outfit. I had decided that I wanted to do a red carpet dress for my first attempt at this project. So I started laying down my big pieces of scrap material to figure out what colors I wanted to go in my dress. I used that piece of green yarn to mark where a waistline could be and then started filling in with all of my different materials to try to get an idea of color and shape and all of that fun stuff that comes with designing outfits. After a lot of playing around, I decided a basic outline of where I wanted everything to be, so it was time to move everything off to the side and define my main materials for my dress. I cleared everything off and grabbed my cup of glue, as well as took apart my strand of yarn, so I had several more wispy threads. Then I cut up my main materials and started gluing them to my inspiration boxes. I ended up using aluminum foil, cardboard, and some leftover white paper from another project that I ended up painting with watercolors. Remember to tap down each of your little sample materials into their boxes once you've glued them. That way none of the edges pop up away from the paper once your materials are all dry. Once the inspiration boxes were filled in, I took some notes off to the side of what exactly I wanted my dress to look like. I think high-low dresses are really pretty, as well as halter tops, so I wanted to try to combine those two design elements into my dress. I went ahead and sketched everything out onto the template using a really light touch in case I needed to erase something, or I wasn't able to cut any of the materials that I had in order to cover over the pencil lines. I didn't think during the initial sketching phase that doing a high-low dress with this template could be a real challenge, but I crossed that bridge when I got to it and I kept on crafting. Now that the initial sketch was finished, I decided what elements of the dress would be what material by labeling them either 1, 2, or 3. For me, 1 was aluminum foil, 2 was the cardboard, and then 3 was the paper that I would paint with watercolors. When you're working with a multimedia project like this, you always want to start with your first layer of material. For me, that just happened to be the aluminum foil top. So I sketched out a basic shape, trimmed it out, and then laid the material over my template to see if I had gotten the shape just about right. Remember, you always want to make your initial shapes bigger than you actually need them. It's a lot easier to trim off material when you need it, but it can be a real challenge to make things work when they're super small. After a little bit more trimming, I was happy with how the top was looking, So I went ahead and grabbed my glue and glued down my piece of aluminum foil to the template. If you're using a thicker material like cardboard or construction paper, you might want to give your piece a little bit of time to dry before you move on to the next element of your design. Luckily, since aluminum foil was super light, I could jump right to the next part. I traced out the basic shape of the skirt on some white paper. Luckily, it was thin enough that I could trace right through the white paper and use the template underneath it as a guide. I had wanted to use some green construction paper as the back part of my high-low skirt, but I found out really quickly this wasn't going to work out. The construction paper was so thick that I could not trace the shape of the legs and feet onto the construction paper. So, as you'll see later, I ended up just going with watercolor for this back section. I was originally going to stick to just using greens and blues on my skirt, but I found out that I wanted a little bit more pop of color, something that reminded me more of summer, so I ended up adding in some orange as well. Remember, whenever you're using watercolors, you need to rinse your brush thoroughly between each color so you don't accidentally muddy the colors in your palette. I wasn't too worried about painting inside of the lines at this point in the project because I had drawn with pencil just dark enough that I could still see the outline of my skirt underneath the watercolor paint. I knew that once the skirt was dry, I would be able to cut along those lines and wouldn't see the messy edges of paint like you're seeing here. When you're using watercolors, if you want to blend two colors together but not make the colors any darker, you can just get your paintbrush wet with some water and then go over the areas that you want to blend. After giving my skirt a little bit of time to dry, I went ahead and grabbed my scissors and cut out the basic shape so I could line it up with my template and make sure that I had the right skirt shape that I wanted. After making sure everything would line up well, I went ahead and grabbed my scissors again and finished cutting out the rest of my skirt shape. After a little bit more trimming and wiggling, I went ahead and made sure that the back panel of my skirt was all in the right spot with where I had traced it earlier. Then I set my big skirt piece aside, grabbed my watercolors, and started on the back section of the skirt. I decided to use orange for the back part of my dress to match the orange accents that I had put on the front part of the dress. After giving the watercolor a little bit of time to dry, I went ahead and got my glue and painted it onto the template so I could press down the front portion of my skirt. I only did the front part near the waist and the knees, and then pressed the skirt down gently to make sure that everything stuck. Once the top part of the skirt was in place, I lifted up the bottom edge and went ahead and glued down the rest of the skirt to the template. Now that the base layer of our design is done, it's time to move on to the accent layers. I went ahead and cut a strip of cardboard to act as a makeshift waistband and decided where I wanted it to go on my template. Then, I started placing feathers to decide how I wanted it to lay over the pretend bodice on our template. To make the feathers stick, I put down a nice layer of glue over the aluminum foil and over the dry watercolor where I knew I wanted the feathers to stick. Then I trimmed off the edge of the feathers and gently pressed it into the puddle of glue I had just formed. Then, for added measure, I took a little bit of glue on a paintbrush and added more glue on top of the feathers. I cut a little bit of a wider strip of cardboard and traced out roughly where the waistline on my template is. I decided to go with this bigger piece so it could help the feathers stick down a little bit more securely, and I had more room to work with when I added glitter later. Once I was sure the feathers were secure, I painted a little bit of glue over the top of my cardboard waistband and got my glitter. Now the best way to add glitter is to tap it gently over a pre-glued surface and just make sure you get a nice decent layer. Then tap the excess glitter back into your cup or onto your work surface and then scoop the rest of it off later. It's like a little bit of the glitter got into the feathers, but that's okay because I ended up actually really liking it. My last step was to cut a small section of my yarn and use it almost as a necklace at the top of my design. This part ended up being really tricky. It took a lot of glue to make the yarn stay down flat, and it was really hard to trim the yarn once I had it glued down. I'd recommend, if you want to add an accent like this, try something like a piece of embroidery thread or even another really thin strip of construction paper. And that was it for all of the decorative pieces. From there, I used some markers to draw on shoes and hair onto my template to really finish out the outfit. The last step was just to give my design a name and then sign it at the bottom. And I was all done. Remember, your imagination is really the limit when it comes to this project. Have fun using a bunch of different materials, and I can't wait to see you next time. Bye-bye.